Okay. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mickey Brock, President of Houston LERA chapter. And on behalf of the Board of Directors, we'd like to welcome you to our second quarter program. I also want to thank the National Academy of Arbitrators of Michigan and Southeast Region for putting together this program and making it available to the chapters. I saw it in Maine and by Zoom, and it's a really good program, so I think you're going to enjoy it. More about our presenters later on, but I just want to thank them for taking time out of their busy schedule to make this presentation today. Our chapter, for the first time since COVID, is having an in-person board meeting, so a hybrid one. So I want to thank Michelle Perino Taylor and Ackerman for making the space available and our lunch, and we're looking forward to having some in-person chapter events in the near future, so look forward to that. And special thanks to Emily Smith, the Executive Director of National LERA, and Bernadette Tiemann, Membership and Marketing Coordinator for National LERA, for partnering with us in many aspects of our daily operations, but also for providing technical support for this meeting. A couple of housekeeping items. If you have any questions, put them in chat. We'll be monitoring those and raise those at the end of the presentation or as appropriate. It's already been mentioned, this meeting is being recorded, and the charts and any information will be posted on our members' website. We ask that you do not personally record the program. Thanks to Moretta Tate for getting the 1.25 hours of Texas Attorney MCLE credits. Unfortunately, we can't do that for other states, but we did take care of Texas. And you'll need to put your name and Texas bar number into chat. And then later on, we'll put the course number into chat for you, and you can then apply using that course number. The course has also been approved for 1.25 hours of SHRM recertification credits. And if you want to apply for that, you need to put in chat SHRM recertification credits, and then put your name, your email address, and your phone number, cell phone. With that, just let me briefly introduce our speakers. First of all, we have Betty Widgeon, who is a member of the National Academy of Arbitrators. She's a former chief judge of the Michigan District Court, and in 2017 was appointed to the Michigan Supreme Court panel of special masters. She arbitrates labor, employment, commercial, and consumer disputes. Probably does a lot more than what I've said there. John Alfano, our other speaker, is also a member of the National Academy of Arbitrators. John has had an interesting career, starting as a science teacher, served as a field staff person for the Maine Education Association, and was a real estate developer and builder and owned several companies. In addition to labor arbitrations, John is a labor mediator, and from 1984 to 2016 served on the Maine Labor Relations Board. I could spend a lot more time going through their careers, but hopefully that will give you just a general idea of the breadth of experience that these people have had. So we're very pleased to have such a distinguished panel with us, and I'll turn this meeting over to Betty and John.
Many stamps today. Give kiddies. We'll be blessed. We all invest in the USA. Sammy!
I'm not going to steal your Fritos corn chips. I buy them from you, okay? Maybe you like better some lead, huh?
Citizens, protect yourselves.
Shanghai, Hong Kong, ik Fuyang.
To demonstrate how to constructing the delicious Japanese club sandwich. Slice a bread ration card, so. Place a piece of a meat ration card, so. Then eat them. Oh, yum, yum, sandwich.
Gonna catch me a rabbit. Well, shut my mouth. Rabbit tracks.
All racial and ethnic groups have been caricatured in this country, but the truth is no group has been caricatured as much and in as many ways as have African Americans. Caricatures become rationalizations for the denial of opportunities. If, for example, you believe the caricature of African American men as coons, meaning lazy ne'er-do-wells, ignorant, people who are cultural parasites, if you perpetuate that caricature and accept that caricature, then that becomes a rationalization for denying African Americans the right to vote, to attend good schools. It becomes, indeed, a rationalization for supporting Jim Crow.
How we got here.
Hey, you see this little game we have over here? Yeah. That's what they call the African Dodger. Oh. Now, I usually have a little color boy that stands behind there, places his head in the hole, and the natives come along and throw the balls at them.
Fantastic, isn't it?
Welcome to the LERA program on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We use images of and examples of intolerance to teach tolerance. The program is designed to help us become aware of our biases, to help us improve our relationships with our more diverse clients and members. I'm John Alfano.
And I'm Betty Widgeon.
We will identify our biases we have by nature and those by nurture, share our personal experiences with bias. We're focusing on race, gender, ethnicity, and religious biases. We realize that other biases exist and deserve research and dialogue also. This program is not designed to shame us. It's not intended to change us. We hope the awareness will help improve relationship with our clients, our members, and with each other.
And after this presentation, we would like for you to please share your experiences so that we may all learn. You may make your comments direct and to the point. We're not looking for war stories, but we do want to hear about your personal experiences with bias, either directed to you or inappropriate behavior that you observed in your work. So again, you can jot those questions down or put them in the chat. Mickey will be monitoring that for us.
Betty will start with comments on women in the labor market. Are we beyond gender bias?
Are we beyond gender bias? Well, according to a recent fact sheet on the state of women in the labor market in 2023, women's participation in the labor force is reaching new highs, with prime age women's employment back to pre-pandemic levels, although longstanding pay gaps and occupational segregation remain challenges. But no, John, we're not there yet. And gender bias runs both ways. We all have it. I remember a few years ago marching into my local bank determined to clear up a long-standing error in my bank statements. Now, 3 managers were available, and with no hesitation, I went straight to the male, who appeared to me to be knowledgeable. I explained in detail my concern, and he nodded, assuring me that he could correct the problem as soon as he consulted with the woman in the next office who was his supervisor and who would walk him through the steps. So there I was, with years of experience discussing ways to recognize and navigate around unconscious biases, doing the same thing. So something John and I will be highlighting is that we all have breathed the same air. We swam in the same water. We've been influenced by the same stereotypes. How about sharing an experience, John?
Mine is somewhat different. In 1971, I worked for the Maine Education Association, then known as the Maine Teachers Association. We made specific efforts to recruit women, lobby for women's rights, and all things related to recognizing women and the value of their independence. What I learned is that women are dependable, willing to take chances, motivated to address wrongful behavior, and will not give up easily. What I heard from the males, women can take chances because they have husbands to support them financially. It wasn't true then, and it certainly isn't true today. I even heard these comments from my extended family, yet all the women in my family, including my mother, were Rosie the Riveters during World War II.
And speaking of Rosie, John, we know that there was some shift in attitudes about women's competence outside the home when a number of them left the home to fill jobs that were vacated by men during World War II. But you know, this was a 2-tier view in the main part, and it's divided along color lines because women of color had long worked outside the home in whatever jobs they could find to supplement the family income. They were never held on a pedestal. Women of color have faced the added layer of having to navigate both gender and race discrimination. For Black women, it's always been different. Well, children, where there's so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes in the South and the women at the North all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I've plowed and planted and gathered into barns and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Sojourner Truth, 1797 through 1883.
Our working premise is that the labor community and arbitrators should reflect the same diversity that exists in the workforce. It doesn't. And why is that? Why do we act the way we do with different races, genders, gay people, people of different religions, anyone different or not familiar to us? Humans tend to act and believe and socialize in ways that are familiar, partially by nature and partially by nurture. Our primitive natural survival skills are based on tribal relationships and associations for basic needs and mutual protection. In modern time, we live in segregated neighborhoods, gated communities, religious communities, etc. Anything that is familiar to us, we tend towards the familiar even when we try to avoid it because our brains take shortcuts. Our brains need to process enormous amounts of data to file and select information from. However, the brain can only process approximately 40 pieces of data at a time. It fills in the gaps with past experiences, understandings, and makes choices from past choices that were successful and led to good feelings, similar to that annoying spell check and autofill that exists in our computers. There was a case of Judge Bennett, who's now a DEI trainer, who was closer to his black nanny than his parents. He consciously rejected bias, yet he has unconscious biases towards people of color. Why is this so?
Well, Judge Bennett could accept his black nanny caring for him, cooking his meals, cleaning up after him, because she was in the correct or the proper station. He related to her within that category. But it's different when people stray out of the classes or categories to which we and our stereotypes have assigned them, and we resist that movement. In general, we want people to stay in their places. Now, as we look at our profession, John, we found that it's much easier for someone like you to make room for someone who looks like you, like your sisters or like your mother, than it is to invite into the profession someone who looks like me, who has long been characterized as other.
Here are a few related questions to ponder. How do we develop a labor community that is as diverse as our clients? How do we put a structure in place to promote underrepresented people into the labor and arbitration field? Who should be moving us in the direction? Arbitration agencies, unions, management groups, National Academy of Arbitrators, all of us? And what are some of the obstacles?
I grouped them into basically two classes, John: assumptions and invisibility. One of the biggest obstacles that I faced was how to become acceptable to others in my profession, that is, other arbitrators and advocates. In our DEIB committee work, we interviewed several arbitrators and advocates about their experiences with bias and obstacles that arbitrators from underrepresented groups have had in trying to build their arbitration practices. One arbitrator I remember spoke about assumptions involving his race, gender, and skin color before he's had the chance even to open his mouth. Now, he is 6'5". He weighs about 250 pounds, and he also happens to have very dark skin. We know that arbitrators of color get labeled often as union sympathizers, although for most of their careers, they may have been in management. They may also be labeled as soft on crime, when as lawyers, they may have preferred and gone to great lengths to obtain a job in the prosecutor's office instead of the public defender's office. But because of that labeling and those assumptions about how they would rule as arbitrators, they're often passed over for a non-minority arbitrator. So basically, the parties and the advocates may unconsciously pass them up because of assumptions and stereotypes that are unconsciously ingrained in their minds about people of color. Now, whereas the same parties wouldn't pause or have that concern when they thought of whether they should select you, John, it can be very different for me. And no matter how similar to whites and non-threatening minorities may try to make ourselves by straightening our hair, always dressing professionally, being careful with our pronunciation, my experience has been that until one, you take a chance on me, and two, take the time to get to know me, the first thing you see and that registers with you is my race. And that one factor automatically ushers in flashbacks of all kinds of stereotypes that you and I both grew up with. They're just there. They're in the air, they're in the water, and they attach. And advocates, parties, and other arbitrators decide that they can't even take a chance on selecting you. John, remember, most of the stereotypes from the cartoons and other things that we've seen of Black people presented, they have been very dark-skinned people, or maybe whites in blackface with very thick lips and bulging eyes. They don't look like Patrick Mahomes or Beyonce. And then when I think about invisibility, maybe you're just invisible. White female arbitrators have spoken of gender-based invisibility, not being recognized as an arbitrator or as a lawyer, but as a secretary, a clerk, or an assistant in the hearing room. Another type of invisibility that minorities face, and I've experienced this, just think about this example, and this is a small one. Walking down the street in my neighborhood in broad daylight on a pleasant day, it's a nice day, it's in a safe part of town, and I try to make eye contact with the person approaching me, and I say pleasantly, "Good morning, hi." The person looks straight ahead or turns their head to the other direction as I pass. I am a member of the National Academy, and I know that it is trying to, in fact, is doing several different things to improve that inclusion and the belonging. But I remember when I first went to one of the meetings, and this was back before 2018, even in my home region of Michigan, getting an NAA member to sponsor me was difficult. And when I got there, I just couldn't seem to fit in. There weren't those overtures. Those experiences, John, were so memorable that I almost didn't apply. Now, some of you may have read the book. It's an old book now that talked about some invisibility. This is a book called Black Like Me, written by John Howard Griffin. Now, he was a white journalist who turned his skin temporarily dark to pass as a Black man. And as I recall, he shaved his head also to keep the hair texture from coming through. Here's a quote from that book. Griffin was talking with white colleagues before passing as Black, and he says, "Do you suppose they'll treat me as John Howard Griffin regardless of my color, or will they treat me as some nameless Negro, even though I'm still the same man?" "You're not serious," one of them said. "They're not going to ask you any questions. As soon as they see you, you'll be a Negro, and that'll be all they'll ever want to know about you." John, do you have any similar experiences?
Yeah, I have three. They're different but related. One was with the implicit bias tests. One is a religious incident and the other is racial. My implicit bias test results embarrassed me, even after years of diversity training, working for employers who did not tolerate biases in any fashion, and reading and research they had done with the NAA DEIB committee. The second incident is religious. I was the only Roman Catholic at a Methodist summer Bible camp in 1953, something that just did not happen at the time. The whispers and comments made me feel that I had to explain that my mother was raised Protestant and thought I needed to learn about the Bible and other religions. Actually, she was worried even when I was 9 years old that I was predisposed to trouble. The third incident occurred when I was a student at Temple University in Philadelphia, where I was good friends with a Black girl. At the time, in August 1964, Philadelphia was on the verge of the infamous race riots. We could not sit in a diner, a donut shop, a White Castle, or walk down the streets without hearing racist comments from whites and Blacks alike. Some of them were threatening. Even my roommates would make racial and lewd comments about us.
That last example, John, reminds me of my experience, an experience I had with a white male friend in college. He declared that he'd love for us to be a couple, but his family would never stand for it. Now, we've stayed friends over the years, but we never dated. And decades later, he brought up the topic and declared that he had been a fool.
Yeah, he was from a generation of young people who witnessed the World War II propaganda, cartoons with racist comments, Blacks, Japanese, and almost 75 years later, the Japanese stereotypes persist: oversized glasses, protruding teeth, sneaky as in Pearl Harbor, and inscrutably wise or menacing. The Black stereotypes also continue. These stereotypes persist partially in films, TV shows to this day. The images that we saw earlier, though clever works of art and entertaining, all promote common racist stereotypes. We were raised on that stuff. They imprinted children and adults from the 1930s today with racist and other myths. During the 1950s to the 1970s and later, those cartoons were commonly seen on TV and marketed to children on Saturday morning. My daughter watched them in the 80s and 90s. Then there were also the TV shows of the 1970s when Blacks were finally cast in primetime shows. However, they were portrayed as pimps, drug dealers, or comical hip sidekick to straight unhip wise white guys. First radio, later TV, with movies all imprinted us with this racism and sexism, all encouraging, promoting, and contributing to our current stereotypical beliefs and behaviors. In more current times, we had Reagan's welfare queens, the Black oversexed women producing baby after baby to qualify for more welfare benefits, all taking from society while the hardworking model citizens like you and I, white folk, pay for them. Continuing with that stereotype was President Clinton, who promised to end the welfare as we have come to know it, using again those stereotypes. Stereotypically, Black women are the mortar that holds their families together, while the fathers and husbands are devious, lazy, and irresponsible, or just not there. All Black people are struggling to survive poverty while living in projects. Black children are in and out of trouble while their fathers are absent. Nurture contributes heavy to our biases. That may answer the question why we don't associate with people of other races and those different from us. Living in Maryland, I have more acquaintances and people I do business with who don't look like me. That never happened in the 43 years I lived in New England. How many friends or acquaintances do you have that don't look like you, Betty?
Actually, John, I have quite a few, but it's when we don't have these relationships that we're prone to rely on information that we've seen and heard over the years. Little or no interaction leads to situations like the next two examples that I'll share. My family had been members of a somewhat mixed congregation for decades. The and this is in the North, perhaps 85% were white, 10% Black, 5% Asian. And our former pastor was an older Jewish man who had converted. Several years ago, we were asked to house for the weekend 2 gentlemen visiting from the Philippines. When we met them at our front door that Friday evening, they froze. They stayed Saturday and Sunday. Later on Monday morning, after having gotten to know us and realizing that we weren't the least bit cannibalistic, they told us as they were leaving, we had never been in a Black house before. We didn't know how to act around Black people. Of course, our unspoken thoughts were, how about just treating us like we're people just like you? But we knew it was in the water, it was in the air. Another one is during the early 90s, a Boston family visited our church for 3 weeks. The husband was a substitute for our pastor during that time, so he came with his wife and their 3 teenagers. And my husband and I had been designated the welcoming committee, so we arrived at the parsonage with a casserole dish in hand, and they were speechless. It was very awkward. We did give them the specifics they needed to get to the church the next day, and then we left. Now, fast forward 3 weeks later, they'd been with us in the church. They'd seen us in leadership positions. And when they were about to leave, they pulled us aside for a little heart to heart. There were hugs all around, and they invited us to please visit if we ever came to Boston. And then they confided, we hadn't had exposure to Black people before, and we didn't know. But I'll have to differ with those friends and say that I think that we've all had exposure to information about others who don't look like us, but by and large, it's been negative, or it's been covered with uncomfortable stereotypes.
I had one racist experience when I was young, which really it's imprinted me. During the mid-1950s, my brother and I were traveling with our parents through Georgia after having spent 2 weeks at Miami Beach in the sun. We stopped for a room in a motor court that had advertised vacancies. My mother, of Sicilian descent, had Black curly hair. My brother, my mother, and I were all quite dark from the sun, because when you're Italian and you get under a light and you turn dark. We all walked into my father, of course, was pale because he didn't like being in the sun. We looked like a mixed-race family. When we walked into the office, the clerk looked at us and said, we don't have room for you. My father, who was not quick on the trigger, said, but the sign says vacancy. My mother got the point quickly. Let's get out of here. I don't know what was happening, but we got in the car and left. My mother explained that the clerk assumed that from our dark skin and her Black curly hair and Pop's whiteness, we were a mixed-race family. I never felt such anger, helplessness, hopelessness, and frustration in all of my 11 years at the time, and since actually. And each time I think of it, that feeling comes back.
You know, frustration, that's an appropriate word, I think. I think that in some ways, some of what we were taught, as well as what we were not taught in our schools, contributed to our biases. On the one hand, we were taught that the greatness of America is that anyone can grow up to be president. We were taught the Horatio Alger myth that anyone can overcome poverty by living an honest life and working hard, and that when we do so, there will be happy endings for all. The message is that failure is a matter of choice, and those who fail have flaws. The United States is a land of promise, founded on the idea that all men were created equal. Though America has faced many challenges during its history, we have always overcome them. In the United States, progress is inevitable, both for the nation itself and for individual citizens who can all achieve the American dream if willing to do the work. But the reality of U.S. history is much more complex because for many, the United States has been a land of broken promises and oppression.
Yeah, we have a lot of advantages that society has given to us. I mean, think of affirmative action. Was legislated to give people of color access to institutional opportunities by race and also by gender in the 1970s. And then there's the concept of the 40 acres and a mule. Shortly after the Civil War, General Sherman signed an executive order allocating 40 acres to freed slaves. Approximately 400,000 acres were distributed. A year later, the executive order was overturned, and most of what was distributed was confiscated and returned to the original white former slave owners. Affirmative action is a modern 40 acres and a mule. Affirmative action actually opened up college admissions to Black students. However, there are indicators that possibly that support among whites have declined over the last few decades. Affirmative action has been labeled as reverse racism. Also, we can have either learned or have been educated to see racism as individual acts of meanness. However, it has been institutionalized and directed towards specific groups, such as the Japanese before and during World War II, the Irish Catholics, the so-called socialist Italians, and Blacks since the early colonial times. Racism hurts people of color while leaving white people free to do what they need to do to make their mark in what was led to believe as a meritocracy. But being white means more than just not being harmed by racism. It also means the ability to get a lot of things easily for free and keep them.
That's right. In 1618, the head right system was created in England to reduce the labor shortage in Virginia. Now, it gave up to 100 acres of land to any white person willing to cross the Atlantic to go to the colonies. In 1705, a Virginia statute required masters to give white indentured servants 50 acres of land, 30 shillings, 10 bushels of corn, and a musket. Unlike the 40 acres and a mule, this gift of land, cash, and food was not overturned. 1705 is the same year the House of Burgesses passed the Virginia Slave Codes. Those laws locked in a brutal system of white supremacy by giving slave owners sweeping rights to control and even torture their slaves, and made it illegal for Black people to employ white people. These two legislative moves drove a hard wedge between poor whites and Blacks who had sometimes joined forces against the white elite.
Yeah, and then we have the Land Ordinance Act of 1785. It transferred formerly native lands into the hands of white settlers. It helped build the nation of white landowners. There was also land set aside for public education. However, it was designated to serve white children, not Blacks, not Native American children. Later, the Homestead Act of 1862 allowed citizens to claim land, Native American land, by the way, for free in the rapidly expanding Western United States. At first, the act excluded the vast majority of Blacks because they were not eligible for citizenship until the Civil Rights Act of 1866. That land went to white people disproportionately, but many families of color did benefit, at least temporarily. The Homestead Act caused African Americans to own 15 million acres of farmland by the early 20th century. Racism within the United States Department of Agriculture at the time caused most of them to lose that land.
And then in 1929, the stock market crashed. FDR supported many initiatives that built middle-class wealth, including the FHA. Now, buying a house before the FHA required a 50% cash down payment for a 3 to 10 year loan. The FHA had smaller down payments, lower interest rates, and the 30-year mortgages we now take for granted. Home ownership increased from 30% to 70%. Most of the homes were built in the suburbs. For working and middle-class people, home ownership is the most powerful way to build some kind of wealth to pass on to the next generations. However, government policies push the practice of redlining, giving those FHA loans to people in predominantly white neighborhoods and communities while refusing to loan to people in mostly Black areas, the only places Black people were allowed to live. And these policies and practices effectively destroyed the value of inner city housing for decades while increasing the value of predominantly white neighborhoods. Between 1933 and 1962, the FHA gave out $120 billion in home and business loans, roughly $3 trillion when we adjust for inflation, and 98% of that went to white people.
And Social Security had its own little hook in it. When it was first created in 1935, it excluded domestic and agricultural workers. Most of them were disproportionately Black people. This blocked 1/3 of all Black workers until the program was expanded in the 1950s, approximately 20 years later. Also, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, known as the GI Bill of Rights, sent veterans of World War II and the Korean and Vietnam Wars to college. The GI Bill made no racial distinctions, but colleges and universities were racially segregated. Black men had nowhere to go except to the few historically Black colleges and universities which couldn't accommodate all of them. And white schools weren't even letting them in. White people came home and had access to government-sponsored education in ways that people of color did not. Millions of mostly white men learned trades and became engineers, scientists, doctors, and teachers.
And Black men were also disadvantaged by being assigned to menial jobs in the military. Later, when soldiers met with job counselors, they were assigned to civilian jobs that matched the skills they had gained in the military. White men came home to become builders, welders, and mechanics. Black men came home to become dishwashers and cooks. And that has been a multi-generational situation for their families, not because of their choices and mindsets. So given the opportunities for whites and Blacks, it kind of begs the question of why Black people are not as successful as whites. The choices they could make within the imposed boundaries limited their access to government programs, education, training, trades, and higher education that were readily available to white people.
And from 1944 until 1971, the GI Bill spent $95 billion on veterans to buy homes, get vocational training, college education, start businesses. In his book, When Affirmative Action Was White, political scientist Ira Katz-Nelson writes that the GI Bill needed Southern support to pass. Lawmakers made sure it wouldn't be administered at a local level, to respect the so-called customs of Jim Crow. Later, private mortgage lenders, employers, trade schools were able to turn away Black applicants. So even though some people of color did benefit from the GI Bill, the overall effect on the law, according to Katz-Nelson, was to vastly widen the wealth and opportunity gaps between white and Black Americans.
In white families, money travels very differently. Generally, it travels from the parent to the adult child, not just in big trust funds, but it may be that the parents can give you a down payment on a home or help you pay for school, buy a car for you so that you can work while you're in school, provide a place for you to live while you're saving to the money to buy a house. And while you're making your way and paying your bills, you don't have to support your mother and father financially. In families of color, because of this history, by and large, money travels in the reverse, from adult child back to the parent. And looking at this history, it's not hard to see why the median white household has 13 times the assets of the average Black household. The average white family headed by someone who never finished high school has more generational wealth, more money, more assets than the average Black household headed by someone with a college degree. So it appears that historically, affirmative action was race-based legislation to provide access to institutional resources and opportunities, but for white people.
Following scenarios are examples of stereotypes and biases. Their fathers are nowhere to be seen. Their wives are left behind to raise the children alone, in poverty, living in tenements, after being abandoned by the husbands and the fathers of the children. The children grow up on the streets with no male role models and no discipline. Their future is big league crime. Our society cannot survive when a large segment has lost its family values. If you had images of Black families, you got caught in a stereotype. No, this is a description of Jewish families during the 19-teens in the United States, when Jewish males abandoned their families in the East, primarily in New York, and many of them going west, never to be seen again by their families.
Here's an example of a bias. In the 1930s, increasing anti-Semitism led to restrictions on Jewish American life from the elite. Restrictions were mostly informal and affected Jewish presence in various universities, professions, clubs, and high-end housing communities. Many of the restrictions originated in the 1920s and continued throughout the 1930s and into the 40s due to the increasing anti-Semitic climate. On the East Coast, the Midwest, and in the South, public and private universities imposed limits on the number of Jewish applicants they accepted, regardless of their high scholastic standing. Similar patterns emerged among elite professions and communities. Law firms hired fewer Jewish lawyers. Hospitals gave fewer patients to Jewish doctors, and universities hired fewer Jewish professors. Across the United States, only 100 Jewish professors were employed in 1930.
A little more up to date, Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology in Fairfax County, Virginia, is one of the most elite public schools in the country. In 2019, U.S. News and World Report ranked it as America's best overall high school. It also educates a substantial racial minority population. 70% of TJ students are Asian Americans, many of them children of immigrants. You might think that progressive education officials would celebrate their successes. Bowing to complaints from parents, the school officials decided to jettison the school's famously tough admission tests in favor of a holistic test, that is subjective and arbitrary, system that will permit officials to reject Asian American students, possibly in favor of less deserving students. Does America love success? Perhaps, but only when the success looks like me.
American citizens of Japanese and Italian ancestry were interned during World War II because they were deemed a threat to national security. Joe DiMaggio's father's fishing boat was confiscated, although Joe was permitted to move about freely. And in the 1920s, pseudoscientists popularized the notion that Italians were a separate race from Anglo-Americans.
The refugees seeking haven in America were poor and disease-ridden. They threatened to take jobs away from Americans and strain welfare budgets. They practiced an alien religion and pledged allegiance to a foreign leader. They were bringing with them crime. They were accused of being rapists. These undesirable immigrants were Irish in the 19th century. In the opinion of many Americans at the time, the British were not sending their best people. These people were not like the industrial Protestant Scotch-Irish immigrants who came to America in large numbers during the colonial era, fought in the Continental Army, and tamed the West. Instead, they were poor, unskilled refugees who huddled in rickety, rat-infested tenements. And even worse, they were Roman Catholics.
They're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They are not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists. And some, I assume some are good people. It's coming from more than Mexico. It's coming from all over South and Latin America, and it's coming probably from the Middle East, but we don't know, because we have no protection. We have no competence. We don't know what's happening, and it's got to stop. And it's got to stop fast.
An act to limit the immigration of aliens into the United States was passed in 1921. It was also known as the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 that established the nation's first numerical limits, reducing by 66% the number of immigrants who could enter the United States. It was meant to promote Anglo-Saxon immigration over Jewish and Catholic immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. It was championed by the KKK and mainstreamed by so-called good or real Americans. It was not repealed until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, 44 years later. Recently, at least one recent former president expressed his preference for Scandinavians over to those less white-looking people.
And more recently, also 3 Democrats, 2 Black males, and 1 white female were charged with disorderly behavior by the Tennessee House of Representatives in April of 2023. They were advocating for gun control legislation during a protest following a mass shooting. There weren't enough votes to expel the white female. However, the 2 Black males were expelled.
Yeah, another recent one, the Montana House of Representatives officially stripped the state's first transgender lawmaker of her ability to speak in the legislature. In a 62-38 vote, the GOP majority House banned Representative Zoe Zephyr from the floor, the gallery, and the anteroom for the remainder of the session. While she will be able to cast votes and retain her seat, the 34-year-old legislator will not be able to participate in debates. Not surprising, the Montana House is made up of 65 males, 34 females, 92 whites, 7 Native Americans, and 1 Hispanic, and 1 marginalized transgender. 61% of the House is over 55 years of age. There are no Blacks, no Asians, or no others in either the House or the Senate.
So at this time, we do thank you for joining us and listening to this presentation. We presented a lot of information that brings up various types of feelings, and we hope that they will raise our awareness and sensitivity, and that they will be a benefit to all of our practices. The originators of the New England DEIB subcommittee researched and reviewed numerous articles, presentations, and videos during the past 2 years, and we've had multiple group and one-on-one conversations with each other. We would like your feedback so that we may improve the program. In our research, we had the opportunity to hear directly from arbitrators, from underrepresented groups, and from women about the obstacles they faced in building their arbitration practices. And we also interviewed advocates from both sides on their observations of arbitrator bias and how it affected them and their decisions about using those arbitrators in the future. So please let Mickey and us know if you'd be interested in being a part of an additional time to share more resources and discuss some practice tips. But we'll turn this back over, I think, to Mickey at this time. Mickey, I don't know if there are questions in the chat, but we will turn the program back over to you right now. Thank you.
Well, Betty and John, thank you so much this is just a wonderful presentation, and there's so much information there that it's really hard to grasp it in one viewing. So I look forward to going back again and looking at the video on that. I have one, I didn't get any questions in the chat, but I have a question for you. Could you just, either one of you or both of you, briefly, and this is aimed at arbitrations, go through the process of briefly how an arbitrator is selected by the FMCS or AAA when there's a union contract, and then maybe talk about the Ray corollary a bit, if you could do that.
John, you want to start?
Yeah, I was an advocate for 13 years, and I used to get, American Arbitration Association was my primary source of arbitrators, and I would get a list at the time, we're talking 1968 to approximately 1980, 82. I'd get a list with names on them with a little bit of a biography, and I would then select the arbitrator that I thought would do the best job and rank them according to my preference. Very seldom in the early days did I get women on the list. Very unusual, actually. And most of the males, all the males that I knew of, were white males. We would meet as a group. The union would meet as a group, a regional group, and we would vet. Periodically, we'd vet the arbitrators who we had experience with, and then we would be able to select what we think would be the best arbitrator based on the case. There was no way to they were all white males. I remember the first female arbitrator I had was probably 1974, and it was quite interesting because I knew the arbitrator vaguely from a program she had presented at a meeting that I was attending. And I knew she was quite neutral and quite sensitive to not being treated like a female. So I instructed my team to sit at the table when she came in and just be quiet. Immediately she walked in the door, and of course the employer side of the table grabbed the chair, tried to help her with her bag, pushed her, just assisted her like she was some kind of, that they would not do to a male. And my people just sat there, and from what I knew of her, she did not appreciate that kind of behavior. So that's the kind of stuff that happened. I will say this, I stopped being an advocate in 1983, and I never had other than a white male or female arbitrator.
I will say something about how arbitrators are chosen as far as where it starts. And when we work with newer arbitrators in the Michigan area, as they do in New England and several other places around the country, as you do in Houston, I know, Mickey. But one of the things we encourage is that they get on a panel for FMCS or AAA because that's where most of the cases are going to come from. The advocates in the audience know that you may go there and get a list from AAA, or you may get a list from FMCS. Now, these are people who have already been vetted by the agency, so you should have the assurity that those people who are on there, these are people that you know should be able to handle your cases. So the big deal is getting on those committees, on those panels. And I used the word in this earlier about becoming acceptable to the parties. That's one of the most difficult things, and that is that people will give you that opportunity. If your name is on the list, then hopefully you've got it halfway made there, because at least your name, if it goes out, if it's circulated, you have an opportunity for people to look at your name, your resume, and to try and find out something about you and look at the other cases perhaps that they have in their case bank. But if your name never goes out, then it's very, very difficult by word of mouth, somebody telling somebody about a newer arbitrator or whatever. Mickey, a dilemma that I know that many people of color wrestle with is, up until now, most of the panels that I've been on, they want your resume, they want your information, they don't ask for a picture. And now we're getting to the point that some are saying, do you want to put a picture on there? You can put, and that could work a couple of different ways. The main concern is that we don't want someone to look at the resume with that picture and say, find a reason, some reason that's not on the surface for not selecting that person just by seeing them. Because if we're cut off before anybody ever gets a chance to see your work, then that's very difficult. So I know there may be pros and cons. Some people may say, well, if they see your picture and then they think about this, and maybe they're looking to see if they can hire a minority arbitrator so they won't end up like John was in his situation. But there are a couple of things to think about on either side of that. Let's see. So yes, individuals, we do work hard to get on those panels. And once we're on those panels, we hope, and we are told in many instances, that the names go out and they are circulated regularly as far as from the general pool of arbitrators that are listed. And then, of course, the parties strike. The parties strike whether they don't want number one, and the other side doesn't want number two, and they keep going down the list until maybe there's just one arbitrator left. There used to be a joke that was among arbitrators that, oh, you were selected. It wasn't necessarily that you were selected because they really wanted you, but that they had so many objections to the others. They didn't know anything about you, so they said, we'll take a chance. And I know that a lot of people from underrepresented areas say, well, at least, give me that chance. It doesn't have to be that they know so much about me, but give me a chance to make that reputation. So that's one of the things that it says the New England group. I'm from Michigan. There's another person from Michigan in this group also. But generally, it started in New England, wanting to look at this and look at arbitrators, look at ourselves, and not assume that just because we come into the hearing room, sit at the head of the table, that we automatically get rid of any biases or all of the biases that we have. We all have them. We will have them, but we can learn how to manage those, how to recognize them first, and then to make sure that we are not falling into those and just excluding people before we really know anything about them. Arbitrators can do the same thing with the parties that come in front of them. We might hear something and decide that that is not as credible as somebody else. Are we basing it on that evidence, or are we basing it on something else about that person? So that's a long answer to your short question.
Well, here's another side of it. Another part is that I think our responsibility in the National Academy is to diversify our membership much more than what it is at the moment. We're primarily a majority white old men, experienced white old men. We have a substantial number of females. We have people of color, but definitely not enough. And that is our responsibility as an organization. In terms of the lists of arbitrators to prospective arbitrators to select from, I believe that's the responsibility of the parties, unions, and management groups to insist that the lists that are supplied by AAA, FMCS, et cetera, are more diverse than they are today, and that they should be working diligently to make that happen, almost to the point of we will have to seek other sources if we can't get a more diverse list. I do not believe that I, as an arbitrator in the National Academy, I don't believe it's ethical for me to go in and tell the unions or management who they should be selecting for their arbitrators, but they should be insisting that they should look less like me and more like Betty.
Okay, could you comment on the Ray Corollary initiative if you think that's appropriate?
I choose not to comment on it, mainly because it's primarily looking to influence labor contracts to have a 30% require a 30% minority list in the list that's supplied by AAA, FMCS, or other agencies. I think that's a conflict of interest as an interest arbitrator or a fact finder to get involved in those numbers in that kind of part of the contract. But I think it's your responsibility as advocates for both labor and management to make that occur.
Okay. Well, thank you. There's one question. We got one more question.
Oops.
And this is, to my recollection, high school has a lot of exclusion and separateness among the student body. Exclusion and separateness may only be addressed through inappropriate behavior by a disciplinarian in high school. Is DEIB promoted in secondary education systems as preventative measures?
It's been a long time since I taught in the public schools. I was a teacher. I quit in 71. I'm not sure. Kids are taught to behave in certain ways, and that comes from home. It comes from society. It's multi-generational too. I mean, it's just not their peers pressing them to behave certain ways or to react certain ways to people who are different from them. Their parents teach them, their grandparents teach them, their great-grandparents teach them. All of them are in that line. How do we change that? I'm not sure. I think teaching the true history of the United States, the true history of racism, and do it frank and openly. It's not a sin. It's a fact. And if we understand where we've come from and what we've been taught, or what I think it affects our behavior going forward.
Right.
I'm not comfortable around racial jokes or ethnic jokes. 15 years ago, I would have, yeah, okay, ha ha ha, and walk away. I'm not even comfortable anymore. I just say, shut up. I don't want to hear it.
Okay.
And so it was a grassroots question related to, like a large percentage of the workforce comes from high school. So, in that respect, it was kind of like a grassroots question related to like not to change the system or anything, but like inoculate high schoolers, like immunize them, right?
Yeah, it's adult behavior. We as parents have to do something. We can't tolerate any of that stuff at home. And not excuse it in any other situations.
Well, we're about out of time, and I just want to thank both of you for just a wonderful presentation. This was so good. Thank you.
Mickey, I want to thank you as you're the president of the Houston LERA. Is that right? Is that the right title?
Yes.
I want to thank you. Mickey and I met in, I think it was 2018. It might have been the year before, but I think it was that year. Our families met at one of the National Academy meetings. And Mickey's always been so easy to talk to and to reach out to. And it was just in February when we were in Dallas at the Southwest Rockies fantastic program that they put on all the time every year, that I sent a note. I think I just sent you a note, Mickey, and said, I'd like to talk to you about something that John and I are doing to see if you might be interested. And from that, you sent me an email and we started discussing, and you went to the main program. But you've been so great to work with. So I appreciate that. Appreciate it.
Thank you for Mickey.
Yes.
Thank you.
If it's okay with Bernadette, can we stay on for about 10 minutes after, if there's anybody who wants to talk with us?
That'd be good. I have just a couple of other things that I wanted to say. Okay. We'll have more Houston LERA events, and I hope that you'll follow us and join in with us. Hopefully we'll have an in-person event sometime soon. I want to highlight the Triad Conference that LERA is putting on in New York City, June 26th through the 30th. It's a meeting of 3 organizations that have never met together before. It's FMCS, LERA National, and International LERA. It's going to be an outstanding conference, and I just encourage anyone to consider participating in this. We'll put the charts and video on the site in a few days, or the video and this presentation. If you're interested in becoming engaged with Houston LERA or possibly taking on a leadership role, contact me. My phone number is 281-732-6918 or brockcm13@comcast.net. And finally, on behalf of the Houston LERA Board, I just want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to participate in this program, and we hope to see you again at future events. And thanks again to Betty and John.
Thank you, Mickey.
Bye, everyone.
That was excellent. Oh my God.
That was great.
I love this demo.
It was good. No, I thought it was really
I'm going to mute myself because we have.
There's food.
Thanks, Mickey.
All right. Thank you.
We appreciate you asking us to attend.
Mm-hmm.